sea monsters, geopolitics of the ocean, ghost ships, all these fantastic ocean based stories that you hear about in movies, in storybooks. Imagine a person who's actually experienced some of this stuff. This is part two of our special conversation with Captain Sid Chakravarty. If you guys haven't checked out part one, I encourage you to first check out part one. He spoke about his time in Antarctica, how he began this entire journey. And part two is an extension of part one. But even if you've not checked out part one, it's okay. You'll still gain a lot of value and entertainment from this particular episode. Make sure you follow the Ranveer Show on Spotify. We're a Spotify exclusive, which means that every episode's available on Spotify 48 hours before it's available anywhere else in the world. This is part two of this conversation about oceans with Captain Sid Chakravarty on the Ranveer Show. I think most of the listeners by this point probably know what megafauna is. So between the time dinosaurs ruled the earth and human beings ruled the earth, there was this long phase where massive animals ruled the earth, which we see in the movies like Ice Age or 10,000 BC, where you have saber-toothed tigers, mammoths. It's said that there are still some megafauna left, but they're probably not discovered. Like there's supposed to be a stegosaurus somewhere in the jungles of the Congo. They say that the ocean is probably the likeliest place where you'll find megafauna because the depths aren't explored. But because you've explored the oceans as much as you have, do you think that could be true? Like the colossal squid is one example of it, but could there be more stuff down there?
As far as I know, and I'm not a marine biologist, right? Like I've worked with marine biologists. I feel like, source of life is photosynthesis and light is needed. And the deeper we go down to the oceans, there's less of that. But that's again to quantify that everybody thought that no life would exist at depths because of the darkness. And now you're finding coral reefs growing in like sulfur vents somewhere in the bottom of the ocean. So I think it's the question. At the same time, off the coast of Greenland, you have a shark today that's about 360 years old. It's called the basking shark. It's the world's oldest living animal. There's nothing else that's as old with it.
What kind of shark is it?
It's a very slow moving Greenland shark. So sharks, there's over 100 species of sharks, right? Like we see Jaws and we're like, every shark is a killer. But there's sharks the size of my palm to the whale shark, which is just like a filter feeder that has no teeth even. So it's one of those filter feeding kind of benign sharks that lives in great depths, cold waters, slow moving 360-year-old shark. I guess it's encountered a lot of like megafauna in its lifetime. But I would think, no, I think there's a lot of bigger, interesting species that'll tell us about life, evolution, and how life adapts at different depths. I'm not so confident that there's going to be a big megafauna that comes to the depths from us.
No megalodon.
No megalodon. I think its time has passed. It definitely existed. But that's to say that we have megafauna with us right now, right? We might not have them in the near future. We've almost lost the blue whale. We've got the orcas that are, we don't really know them. We've got great white sharks, which is a megafauna. We've got toothfish, which is a megafauna. We've got like animals which in their little ecosystem, whether that's a reef, whether that's the wide open ocean, they exist out there. And I think recognizing that we have megafauna right now is something that we'd really do good, just recognizing that rather than saying we'll find one in the near future.
Have you come across a great white shark on your travels?
Never a great white shark.
Tiger?
But a tiger, yes. I've seen a tiger during diving. And in Australia, there's these shark attacks that happen to surfers. And it's a great white shark that are very often like chomps on a surfer that's out in Western Australia.
Dude, my legs feel something as you say that. Like, I don't know, man. I actually have a fear of sharks.
Yeah. It's understandable, right? Like we are told, we see, and it's a reality. It's like a tiger. Like it's a apex predator. It's not just megafauna. It's also eats everything that's out there. It does cross ocean voyages. It survives as a solitary animal and it looks up and it sees a surfer paddling out and it's like, oh, there's a seal out there. And it goes and takes a chomp. It happens to be such a big chomp that it takes half your leg away or your arm away. But then in response to that, the public is like, we have to cull sharks. So the government will send out boats and they'll start killing sharks. And most of the sharks that they kill are tiger sharks. So actually in Australia, I've seen a lot of dead tiger sharks because they get shot thinking they're great white sharks and come back.
How big are they, tiger sharks?
They'd be about as wide as this room, 7 to 10 feet.
Okay.
Yeah, diagonally across.
That's big, man.
Yeah. They are
Wow.
big. I think there's life at sea, which is so much bigger, like a bus, right? Like if you were to walk out and see a bus just standing and it was a animal on land, you'd be like, my God, this animal is big. I think somehow at sea, because of the ecosystem being so big, they relationally get scaled down. But that's a big animal, right? Like a blue whale is immense.
Have you dived with? You said you have dived with tiger sharks.
I've seen them on a dive in the Maldives.
What goes on in your head when you know what this animal is capable of?
I don't know. I mean, I have this naive belief, and I think that naive belief is one day going to not be. I'll look at it like I used to be naive, but at the moment I'm still naive. I feel like that sense that you spoke about the whales, I think there's a certain amount of respect that exists. And I feel like if one conducts themselves with respect in almost like not of course physically also, but also just like submitting to that animal's ecosystem, right? Like you are with a scuba tank in a mask for 30 minutes. That animal's there for 30 years. It's home or hunting grounds or whatever. I feel like that sentiment is the safety barrier between that animal and me. That's what I at least naively, like I said, tend to believe. Because on that same dive, I had this other shark, I forget which one it was, but it came and bit the fin of one of the divers. And he just stood there and it bit its fin and he lost a chunk of the fin and then we continued diving.
You mean the flipper?
Yeah, there was the flipper.
God, wow.
And
What animal was this?
It was a shark. I forget which shark it was, but it was a shark. It was a predator shark that came and bit it. So I feel like that's the safety barrier, perhaps, that you respect an animal and the animal respects you visiting it for a little bit.
Yeah. Both tigers and sharks have these like little dead eyes, dude. Like I want to say it's like full of emotion and dead at the same time. Do you know what I'm talking about? Little dots in the middle of the eye messes you up. Like I remember about this referencing that same Bhopal zoo I went to. It's called Van Vihar. So they say that the tiger they've kept there is a man-eater, like so-called man-eater. And the moment you're near that cage, so they've obviously kept in like this massive enclosure, right?
Yeah.
So you go through Van Vihar and you see different open enclosures. They've got one open enclosure for crocodiles, open enclosure for elephants. And what I mean by open enclosure is a massive field separated by like a water body.
Okay.
So they can't like, reach you. And at the edge of the water body, they have sort of a kind of not a cage, but like sort of a heighted piece of land. So as you're going through the park, you get to see crocs, you get to see like elephants. Deer are free to roam in the park. So as you're going on the road, you just see a deer like kind of sprint across. But I remember that specific enclosure with the tiger. So they stopped the vehicle like about maybe 30 feet away from the cage. And even in that 30 feet ka radius, you feel some strange energy.
Okay.
Like I don't know what to describe it as, but I felt like it was strange energy. And they said, okay, we've reached the tiger enclosure now. And they tell you to stay quiet, which makes it even more eerie because everyone's quiet around you. And then you get off your vehicle and as you go closer to the cage, you can feel more and more eeriness. Because that animal is so massive and they've told you it's a man-eater. It just has a vibe that it spreads. This dominant energy that it spreads. And then you go up and it's 2-3 tigers are just in that cage chilling, vibing. They're not chilling. They're probably extremely sad that they're in a cage. But they're just there and that energy is taking over. And I'm vlogging because I'm a YouTuber and I'm talking to the camera. I'm saying, oh, we've reached the tiger enclosure, whatever. I go up near the cage and the guy who kind of sits and like looks over the cage, he says, don't go any closer because it can pounce at the cage. And if even one of its nails hits you, you might have to get a rabies shot.
Right.
And a lot more than a rabies shot probably. So the moment he said that, I shat my pants a bit and I put my phone down and I looked up at the tiger. And I saw these 2 like dead eyes just staring at me. Then it looked away for a bit. I kept staring at it, then it looked back at me. To kind of see that, okay, is this guy still looking? But the second time it looked back at me, I felt like it scanned how I taste, how I smelled, what my thoughts are, everything. And I couldn't maintain eye contact. I just looked down out of respect and fear. And it's behind a cage.
Yeah.
It's not even in the wild. And when you see photos of sharks, I feel like there's the same look in those sharks' eyes.
Yeah.
Just very eerie, man. But the deal with sharks is you're in the open ocean where it's dark and blue and cold and dangerous. And these animals just dominate that space. So I'm sure you feel that dominant, eerie energy around them.
I mean, it's dominant in the sense that maybe they're not dominating, but one definitely submits to them. And we used to take these swim stops in the middle of the ocean. And of course, no cage. So for most people, it's like, how deep is the water here? So we just stop the ship and we'd put out a life buoy and we'd say, whoever wants to jump, just jump off. But know that there are sharks in the waters and big fish and all. And nobody is really safe. And people would jump off. One, they're jumping into water that is 3-4 kilometers deep, right? Like it's incredible to think that you're bobbing on the surface and there's 4 kilometers of ocean just under you. But very often I'd speak to my friends and be like, why do we jump off? I used to jump off every time. And I feel like a lot of people are like, I'll be okay if a shark takes me. Like, I think it's not to say that I'm taking on death, but it's like, would that be such a bad thing that you jumped off in the middle of the ocean and you got bitten by a shark? It's naive and I know it's probably foolhardy, but in that moment, there's also something about that experience, which you're not thinking about death, but you're like, if it happens, we took the risk of entering its ecosystem. It's not a bad animal. It's just that we happened to be there and it made a miscalculation about who I was. And I think it'd be okay. I mean, not for the others, but I think it'll be okay.
So messed up thought, dude, getting eaten underwater. Because, I've dived, and what people don't understand about diving is what you can't hear underwater. And that's what people find meditative about diving also, that, it's silence and, it's, where do you get to hear this kind of silence on earth? But that's how they look at it, how seasoned divers look at it. If you're not familiar with diving and if you have a phobia of the ocean, that silence can get to you. Where you can just hear your own tank. Now imagine going through something chomping off your leg in the middle of the water and only you're able to feel the pain. Imagine with someone in your group. Rude question. But have you ever come across Somali pirates? Or pirates from that part of the world?
So this is really interesting. And I say it because I have really read up, not a lot, but a little bit into piracy in general, or Somalian piracy. When I started sailing in 2001, that's the first time I joined a ship. And I used to be on the ship that used to go from Antwerp, which is in Belgium, to a small port in South Africa. And we used to come down the Suez Canal and we used to come down. We used to sail along the Somalian coast. Like you could see Somalia's land. And there used to be advisories that said that keep a lookout in the night. So I was a trainee and there were other workers on the ship as well. And we used to put these bulb lights across on the outside of the ship in the night. And we'd walk on the deck with a torch. And it was like we were doing piracy watch. By 2011, my first crossing with Sea Shepherd, the advisory was that you keep 1,000 nautical miles, which is about 1,800 kilometers from the Somalian coast, because piracy has exploded so much. So it went in that 10-year period from being something that was petty thievery to being like guns and arms, and to America even make a film about it.
They even use bazookas, I've heard.
Yeah.
Like rocket launchers, bazookas.
Yeah.
They have some heavy machinery. I don't know how.
They do. I mean, Somalia has a history of gang wars, militia, funded civil wars, a lot of foreign intervention. I don't know too much about that, but there are accounts of American intervention, etc., that have happened there as well. But from what I know, there was a lot of dumping of nuclear waste that used to happen from European countries into the waters of Somalia. And there was also a lot of fishing that used to happen by foreign fishing fleets, because Somalia was this poor country that couldn't do anything about controlling its waters. And so a lot of people who went... So one has to realize, and I think people should know, that it's not easy one day to suddenly become a pirate and be 1,500 nautical miles out at sea. Like, you have to be a very skilled seaman with years or generations of experience at sea to be able to undertake something like that. Because these guys were going out in little skiffs, which is these thin boats with a single engine. And they were surviving by catching fish, by cooking on the boats, until a merchant vessel came by. Then they would board it and take it to Mogadishu, which was their main capital port and all. So it was these fishers and coastal people who largely were getting completely wiped out by the dumping of waste and overfishing, who went out with And of course, there was American and European intervention. A lot of military went out there, Navy went out there. But again, I know somebody who's a maritime lawyer in Somalia, and he said, you do not know the amount of work that the local mosques and the local community leaders did to bring these boys back into the family and the community from being pirates out at sea. So I feel like, of course, it was a huge problem. And it became a huge problem because it was choking and really hitting the world's shipping trade. And today's global economy is nothing without the shipping trade. So insurance rates were going up. Fishing vessel owners were shit scared that their vessel was going to be taken. So they had armed guards on board. The premiums would go up. Crew premiums would grow up. Everybody was like, so it was costing a multi-billion-dollar industry millions. And that's why the military stepped in, the Navy stepped in. It's no longer where it was. But I think we only hear one side of the story, which is the Captain, whatever.
Captain Phillips.
Captain Phillips story. I was going to say Captain America. Could be the Captain America. But we hear that side. But there's a lot else that has happened. Why it happened and why it stopped. And I think that's important. But yeah, that it used to be scary. Like literally, there'd be American helicopters and Chinese and Russian, like joint patrols happening. And the ships would be in a convoy just going. And, you know, any skiff you'd see, you'd be like, is it a pirate? You'd have to call the American warship. They'd send a helicopter. It would take a round and it'll be safe. WhatsApp videos of like people shooting dead fishing boats, like armed guns, just like on ships and all. Like it became like this Wild West kind of thing suddenly in the 20th century.
Wow.
Yeah.
Have you seen any up close?
No, I haven't seen pirates up close. But the thing is that they all look the same. So you pass many skiffs, but perhaps because you were in a convoy and the moment was not right that you didn't get attacked. But in that period, if you're on the ship, I've heard maydays. Mayday is like when you're in trouble, you just make this call that there's been a piracy attack on a ship that's 20, 30, 50 nautical miles away. So it was a very real thing that happens for sure.
Wow. So you don't kind of think of the life of people in the merchant navy, but there's all these unforeseen circumstances like this. Are there even more unforeseen circumstances that happen out on sea, which you only know after you've gone out on sea that much?
I mean, two examples which would be very pertinent right now in times of COVID. One is COVID, of course, disrupted the entire economy, but it also disrupted movement. And lots of crews on ships were stuck for the longest time without being able to come home. Somebody's lost a parent or a wife or a child or a friend to COVID and they just couldn't come home. So people were stuck. That was one of the big things that happened with crew members. And the reason they're stuck is because you need a visa to be processed out of the foreign country onto a plane. You can't afford it yourself. You can't leave. So a lot of people got stuck because it was too expensive for companies. Because from here, nobody wanted to go on board. You couldn't bring people from there. And the second thing is that a lot of companies went bust. So of course, big companies like Maersk and APL and all that we know about and we see containers on our roads survived. But a lot of small companies went bust. So owners just started abandoning ships and they just overnight, nobody owned the ship. So the ships ran out of food, they ran out of water, they were just on the mercy of some local church organizations, etc. And so, yeah, so a lot, I think the maritime domain, whether it's fishing or shipping, is a forgotten domain in the sense that once you're on a ship and away, it's not like you're in no man's land because a ship is flagged in Panama, it's owned, it's got so many jurisdictions that you're a transboundary citizen on a floating ship without really anybody controlling you. You could be Panama's responsibility. If you're Indian, you could be the Indian government's responsibility. If you're passing through the Suez Canal, you could be Egypt's responsibility, but nobody takes responsibility. So it becomes like this forgotten amongst overlapping mixed control areas.
You know how I spoke about how virtual reality and megafauna has become a theme of the podcast?
Yeah.
Another theme of the podcast is things like the skull kept next to you, which
Okay.
is the occult. Do you have an opinion on the occult?
I don't actually.
Okay. Have you had any occult experiences out in the ocean?
Not really.
Any
No,
ghost
no.
ships?
Not ghost ships, but I've seen ghosts in the sense of like not real ghosts. But I remember in 2001 again, right when I started sailing, I used to have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and take these fire rounds. And the fire at 4 o'clock, everybody's sleeping. It's just like one engineer who's in the engine room, the trainee cadet, and the watch officer. It's 3 people awake, and it's this big 200-meter long ship. And you have to walk and take this round. And I remember just like walking into this darkness, already scared, like trying to see. And then suddenly I see these two people walking towards me, like 100 meters away. And I was like, I ran into the corner, and then I was like, if I go up, that chief officer will be like, yeah, this trainee cadet is useless. He's scared and all. So I have to do this around. And then I looked again after 5 minutes. Those people are there only moving. I'm like, what is this? So I went up slowly inching. And then I realized it was two raincoats that were hanging with just a blower that was blowing. And you know, these occult stories, because you hear about ghost ships and things like that, it was just like,
Yeah, maybe out there in the ocean, when things are that dark, you feel it even more.
I mean, there's somebody called Ian Urbine. I don't know if you've heard about him, but he was an investigative journalist with the New York Times, and he did some other stories as well. And he got a Pulitzer grant to do a series of stories which ran in the New York Times as a series called The Outlaw Ocean. And then he wrote a book as well. And it's interesting, like his research, it's on fishing boats, it's on shipping vessels, it's on oil rigs, it's on abandoned marine islands, it's on insurance crimes. And it's a very interesting take on what all goes on out there, right? Like, so much of it is there. And the ocean has a reputation. It's murky, it's dark. There are ghost ships just drifting, completely abandoned. Recently, one ship showed up in the UK filled with rats. It had been out there for many years and just, yeah, so like things happen, all kinds of things happen.
And the rats on the ship were multiplying.
Yeah.
What happened to the humans on the ship?
Nobody knows. I didn't trace back the story. I'm sure they found out, but the day it arrived, it was just rats. On a ship.
That's crazy. You spoke about. One second, I lost my. So I'm too into this rat story. Have you read some of his stuff? This investigative journalist.
Yeah, I mean, I met him. He wanted to come on my ship for covering one of the campaigns. So we did this reconnaissance in the middle of the ocean where he came on a ship and then I came on a ship.
What is a reconnaissance?
It's like we just met in the middle of the sea unofficially.
Oh.
Just like in the sense that I'll come to so-and-so latitude, so-and-so longitude at so-and-so hours. I'll wait there for 2 hours. If you show up, you show up. If not, so that's a reconnaissance. So then he's like, I'll be there. And then once we missed each other and I was like, I have to go. Then he's like, no, I'm coming. So next day again we went.
Like an ocean Tinder date.
Yeah, kind of. And then he came, he spent a little bit of time with us and all. And then I met him in London. He had come for his book launch. So I was there with him as well. Yeah.
Did he tell you anything crazy? Like any of these ghost ship stories or anything murky?
I mean, so he did, but I also, because I used to do a bit of work in Indonesia in the middle with labor supply chains and looking at worker conditions on boats. And like, there's video evidence and photo evidence that very often just gets given to you. And there was this one case that in 2015, I got given a USB stick through a friend of mine about just these, saying that somebody's died on board. And these are his photos. And it was essentially a 3-month filming process of an Indonesian worker being slowly killed on board by his captain by physical torture.
Why?
Just he was a... So there's a theory that is that working at sea is so arduous that you have to maintain a control. And violence on a couple of crew members who are new is a way for the captain to tell the others that this can be your fate as well. So there's a lot of nasty stuff that happens. And this guy essentially used to be prodded with an electric cattle prodder, given electric shocks, passed out. His knees were capped off with a fishing knife.
God.
He was beaten and jumped on till he passed on. He was thrown off a deck. And he ultimately died because his body couldn't take it. So, that's murky where you see a man who left. I went to Indonesia and met his family and stuff like that as well. So, yeah, I mean, and this is very common. There's the accidents that happen, but then there's deliberate killing of people that happens as well. And it just happened that this guy's body was going to be tossed into the ocean. But that fishing trip, another fisher had a fishing accident where the fishing hook caught him and he went overboard and he died. And so it's considered that if he had come back with 2 crew members missing, it would have been too much and would have raised. 1 crew member missing is okay. Everybody turns a little bit of a blind eye.
Really?
So he said, I have to bring this guy back. So they packed his emaciated dead body into a body bag, put it in the fishing freezer and brought it to Taiwan. Where one of the crew members was just like, what have I experienced? I've experienced torture of a new crew member for 3 months until he's died. And the other one has just fallen overboard. Nobody went looking for him. So he, through his sources, just sent out this USB stick because he had been filming it on his phone.
What the fuck?
Fishing hooks in the head, bleeding everywhere. Like really, really dark and murky stuff.
Why didn't they go after that guy who fell off?
Because their fishing gear was out, and it would have meant cutting the fishing gear and turning the ship around. And if you lose that fishing gear, as I said, fishing trips are 3-4 years. You don't carry that much extra gear. So it would have meant wasting gear and having to actually save a man's life.
Morbid question, but
Yeah.
when he's floating out there, how do you think he would have passed away? Just out of hunger and thirst? Because I've read that a lot of people who are lost out at sea, eventually, the theory says that they get eaten by reef sharks. Like, that's one of the believed theories. Do you think that's true? Like, if you're just out at sea,
Not by reef sharks, because reef sharks will be around reefs, but tigers, tiger sharks, great white sharks,
They eventually find you.
makos, these are like predator ships. They'd probably kill you. Barracudas as well. Like, they'd probably come and take a chomp off you.
Yeah.
But yeah, most likely dehydration and tiredness.
Have you ever seen any dead bodies just floating around in the ocean on your trips?
No, not really. But again, I've seen a lot of videos and stuff like that. Like there's this video. In fact, Ian went after this story. Not Ian. Another investigative journalist went after this story, where there was a Chinese fishing boat just shooting dead 4 Somalians in the water. These Somalians were fishermen and they thought they were pirates. So they just bought out this gun, and it's captured on video where he's like taking pot shots at them from the ship. And because he's never fired a gun before, they don't kill in one shot. So he shoots somebody's shoulder, then he shoots somebody's head, and everybody's like cheering him on. And ultimately, all 4 are dead. They're just exploding heads in the water. So like, there's a lot of murky stuff that happens. And people tell these stories. Like, they'll be like, yeah, I met this friend. His backbone was broken on the ship, so they chucked his body. Somebody else will say, I went to join a ship in Pacific, but I was working off Somalia for 4 years. I've killed pirates and stuff like that, and just come home last week. Like, there's wild stories that come out from human endurance at sea under working conditions.
Have you heard any alien stories? UFOs, things like that?
I haven't.
Because that's another
really,
theme
yeah.
of this podcast.
In fact, when you were talking about your man-eating tiger, I was thinking about The Arrival. Have you seen The Arrival?
Yeah, we spoke about
I
it.
thought about it, like when they go in for the first time and they're like, what are you, with the birds and all? I felt like you were describing that scene.
Yeah. Man. I don't know. It's just like, this is one of those episodes that I have been looking forward to since 2 years, but we've never had a chance to create. So this is not the end of the podcast. I have more questions.
Okay.
I'm just...
How long have you been doing that? Yeah, it's 10 o'clock.
I'm appreciating a brother, an oceanic brother. Maybe the last section, which is another theme of the show.
Okay.
I think earlier on in this episode, you spoke about geopolitics of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
What's actually happening out there? And is that something that interests you? Do you study it? Like, is it something that you know something about, which you can share with the audience?
So, in the sense that I'm interested in geopolitics, but not maybe from a national security point of view, where most geopolitical conversation comes in. I'm interested in it from the point of view of what role fishing plays in geopolitics. And it's very interesting because very often we think about fishing as just being fishing. But when a fishing boat is out in the oceans, let's say it says an Indian fishing boat in the Indian Ocean, it's a part of India that is in the Indian Ocean. And if there are 1,000 fishing boats from India, there's 1,000 pieces of India that are out in the Indian Ocean. So geopolitically, it makes sense that something like fishing, which is primarily an economic activity, also becomes a way to exert some amount of presence in the world's oceans. So that's one thing. The second thing is we are living in the age of what is now known as the blue economy or the ocean economy. So we've had the green revolutions in agriculture. We've had the mining extraction that's happened. Now we are seeing something that's happening at sea. So extractive activities are going out to sea. There's a lot of ports that's happening. There's a lot of shipping, etc. that's happening. And alongside that, these investments need security. And therefore, geopolitics is becoming a part of national security related to ocean investments in a big way. And fishing vessels do become a part of that. So, for example, China has expanded immensely in the Indian Ocean. But the Indian Ocean is a huge security concern for America in the sense that it's got the Persian Gulf, so the biggest oil routes of the world. It's got the Suez Canal, which empties out into the Arabian Sea through the Red Sea. So it's a big shipping route for them. And then just extended Indian Ocean, the Malacca and the Singapore Straits, where about 90% of all the trade passes through. So what happens when China's dominance in this areas grows? It's geopolitical in the sense that America is not fishing back. But what if Chinese boats have arms and can launch a militia kind of war against American bases? So there's geopolitics in fishing that plays out like that. And it's not just fishing, it's always linked with something. And so when we look at Indian fishing that is expanding into the Indian Ocean, it's not just Indian fishing. Of course, economically, it's claiming part of the ocean through the resource, but also that presence then adds and links up to all of these things. So that's one thing. The other side of the geopolitics is that maritime borders are very recent. Europe has existed pretty much for a long time in the way it has. But maritime boundaries were only formed in the early 80s. And a lot of countries properly claimed them much later. So, for example, India's got a maritime boundary with Pakistan, with the Maldives, with Sri Lanka, with Bangladesh, and then with Thailand from Andaman and Nicobar. That's 5 maritime boundaries. Fish don't respect boundaries, they just flow over. But resources can only be claimed if you have that territory. So geopolitically, it's also contested. Whose waters are what? Where do minerals lie? Whose fish? If I capture them on this side of the line, they're mine. If I capture them on that side. So geopolitically, again, there's this fluid boundary of fishing, etc., that come in. So I'm interested in those aspects of geopolitics.
You gave me 2 great podcast episodes today, unknowingly. So that was part 2 of our special 2-part conversation with Captain Sid Chakravarty. If you liked it, do share these podcasts as much as possible. The podcast, I hope, will grow through conversations like this, people like this, experiences like this. And honestly, it's going to grow when you guys share all these episodes on WhatsApp, on your social media. So make sure you share TRS and make sure you follow TRS on Spotify. The Spotify exclusive, which means that every episode is available on Spotify 48 hours before it's available anywhere else in the world. And for now, what I will tell you is that I still hate the idea of scuba diving. There's something about the oceans that just scares me immensely. And while I got fascinated because of this conversation with Captain Sid, I also got kind of scared about what's out there, about the monsters which swim and about the monsters that board ships. I hope that this was one of those conversations that stayed with you in the same way that it stayed with me. Right after recording this, I went up to Sanchit and I told him that, I think we've got a super hit podcast in our hands. It was so good that we had to divide it into 2 parts. So make sure you watch both the parts and make sure you keep sharing episodes like this of The Ranveer Show. Thank you.